I showed a video at the party of my wife cheating with her boss. I condemned her. Then the boss left her, and I made a final sweep of the apartment, making sure everything was packed for my trip. It was a big move, and I didn't want to leave anything behind. After 20 years in marketing, I had taken retirement at 44 and was set to start a new chapter. I told my wife of 22 years, Linda, that I'd leave the old family car at the airport, but it was still parked in the garage, filled with boxes for the office. Retiring early was the best decision I ever made. By regularly investing in tech stocks and rolling my bonuses into a private fund, I avoided heavy taxes and built a retirement check that dwarfed my old salary. My investments in digital startups had paid off, and the retirement checks went straight into my new Chase Bank account. I cashed in a few options last Friday, including a $650,000 stock sale, a tidy sum that Linda had no idea about. To avoid it becoming a contested asset, I'd held off depositing it until today. With plans set for a quieter life, I donated all my expensive suits and most of my furniture to charity, keeping only what I'd need for the move. A lower cost of living in Tennessee, compared to New York, meant I'd be in a better financial position. I rented a U-Haul, booked under my cousin Steve's name, paid in cash, and filled it with what little I wanted to keep. I was done with the city. Moving back to the small town where I grew up sounded perfect, especially with Linda's attitude lately. She hated the idea of leaving New York, had no respect for the farm I inherited from my parents, and her recent behavior sealed my decision. She'd forgotten that I still owned that farm, which she openly despised. Her coldness and dismissive attitude convinced me that it was time to go. The house had been in the family for generations, and I'd rented the land to local farmers. It provided a nice emergency fund, and with my skills, I could repair machinery for a living. My cousin had gotten the old place livable for me. I called Linda to remind her I was leaving for a business trip before she returned from hers. She said she'd be home soon after 2 weeks away for work, and I told her everything was set for her surprise party. Our 3 sons had planned it while she was gone. Linda didn't know how big a surprise it would be. I hadn't told our sons what I'd found out, and they had no clue about her affair. Linda's boss, Greg Williams, and his wife were coming to the party thanks to our youngest son's invitation. Greg was apparently always bragging about Linda's work, and his wife wanted to meet her. The party was planned for 6 p.m. Linda would arrive at 5:30, while our sons and family would be setting up. The final part of the surprise was a video I'd recorded. I left instructions for the boys to play it just before the night wound down. I'd explain everything in my own words. It was time to make the first call of my new life. My middle son, Jack, would get my new number once I was settled. He suspected something was going on when I showed him the private investigator's report on his mother's affair, but he thought I'd wait to handle things quietly. He learned differently tonight. By 4 p.m., Linda's flight was in the air, and I made sure to delete all my old social media accounts, cutting off any easy way for her to track me. I sent copies of our financials to my lawyer and confirmed the market value of the house at $750,000. With my half, I could easily buy a new home and furnish it. I threw my phone into the trash under the kitchen sink and left the apartment. Leaving New York behind after 2 decades was bittersweet, but heading back to Tennessee felt right. Only a few close friends and my sons would miss me, but I knew the video I left would change a lot more lives than just mine. On the road, I stopped at a Verizon store and bought a burner phone. I made one call to a woman I'd reconnected with recently, Sarah, an old high school friend. "This is the new number," I told her. She replied, "Got it," before I turned off the phone and continued my drive. Linda and I had met at a charity gala in the city years ago. She was a rising star in fashion marketing, and I was already knee-deep in tech consulting. We'd married within the year, and while Linda remained the polished, glamorous figure she always had been, I'd become the stereotypical dad with the extra weight and receding hairline. Linda, however, still turned heads. After 2 weeks on a business trip with Greg, her boss and lover, she looked forward to getting back home. But it wasn't the life we shared she missed. It was the thrill of juggling her career and her secret life. Still, the stability of our home, and perhaps her guilt, kept her coming back. She arrived home to a big surprise. All 3 sons and their wives had arranged the perfect party. There were at least 50 family members and friends, with Greg and his wife being the unexpected guests of honor. Linda basked in the attention. Around 8 p.m., our eldest son, Brian, announced the surprise video message from me. The patio went silent as the 70-inch TV came to life. My voice filled the air, wishing Linda a happy belated birthday. I reminisced about the past year, sharing happy moments, our last anniversary, the birth of our first grandson, and the marriage of our youngest son. Then I got serious. I found something unexpected when I returned from my last business trip, I said. It changed everything I thought I knew about my wife and my family. The video cut to footage from our home security cameras, Linda and her co-workers casually discussing their affairs. The silence was deafening as more details surfaced. Names, places, times. Linda's face turned pale when Greg's name came up. I had hired a private investigator to follow her, and the video showed Linda and Greg during their last trip to Atlanta. Romantic dinners, a shared hotel suite, and a weekend at a beach resort made it clear this was no ordinary business trip. I ended the video with a final message, Linda, you've chosen your path. Now I'm choosing mine. The screen went black, and the party was over. After the video played, the patio was filled with an eerie silence. The once festive air had completely shifted, and every guest was too stunned to speak. Linda's face was frozen in shock, the color drained from her cheeks. Greg Williams stood rooted to the spot, his arms still awkwardly around his wife, who looked like she'd just been punched in the gut. The entire room was reeling from the revelations, but I knew it was time for them to face the truth. My sons, too, were speechless. Brian's hand trembled as he held the remote that had just played my message. Jack, who had been so proud of the party he helped plan, stared at his mother with a mix of confusion and disbelief. And Adam, my youngest, was gripping the back of a chair, his face pale. Greg's wife, Beth, was the first to move. Her face flushed with anger. She turned to Greg and slapped him across the face. The sound echoed across the patio like a gunshot. "How long?" she demanded, her voice quivering. Greg, still reeling from the slap, stammered, trying to deny the obvious, but the video had said everything for him. Linda still hadn't moved. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, as if her brain was struggling to process the destruction of the world she'd carefully built. I had wondered whether she would react with tears, anger, or defiance. But what I saw instead was an empty stare, a woman who realized she had lost everything. As I drove further from New York, I received a text from Jack, my middle son, asking where I was and if I was okay. I didn't reply right away. I needed space to process everything, to leave the remnants of that life behind. When I finally pulled into a rest stop a couple of hours later, I texted him back. On the road. I'm fine. You know what to do now. It wasn't long before my phone buzzed again. This time, it was Sarah. Saw the news, she said. You were right to leave. Call when you can. I shut my phone off for the night. I wasn't ready to explain myself to everyone just yet. For now, I needed peace, and I had it on the empty highway with nothing but the hum of the engine and the faint glow of headlights ahead of me. I pulled into a motel off the interstate and got a room for the night. Tomorrow, I'd be in Tennessee, where my real future was waiting. The next morning, after grabbing a coffee and hitting the road again, I turned my phone back on. It didn't take long for the notifications to start pouring in. Missed calls from Linda. Several texts from Adam, who seemed conflicted about everything. A couple of calls from my lawyer, confirming he'd received the papers I sent before I left. Then, a message from Jack. Dad, I think you need to talk to Brian. He's not doing well. I sighed. Brian, my oldest, had always been the most sensitive of my sons. He took things hard, and I knew that my sudden departure would hit him the hardest. I tried to prepare him for this, but no amount of planning could shield him from the truth he learned last night. I called him. Dad. His voice cracked as he answered. Brian, I'm here, I said, my tone softening. How are you holding up? There was a long pause. I don't know. I don't know what to think anymore. Mom, how could she do this? How could you both keep this from us? It wasn't something I could just explain over dinner, Brian. I didn't want you and your brothers to be dragged into it until the time was right. But you left. You're not coming back, are you? His voice broke again. No, son, I'm not. I've made my decision, but I'm still here for you and your brothers. Always. Brian sniffed, trying to pull himself together. So what happens now? That depends on your mom. I've already filed the papers. The house will be sold. Your mom will get her share, and I'll move on. And us? What about us? You boys are adults now, but you'll always be my sons. I'll be in Tennessee. If you want to visit, my door is always open. You don't have to choose sides in this, but I'm not going to stay in New York. The conversation went on for a while, Brian unloading everything he had been holding in since the party. By the time we hung up, I knew he understood, even if he didn't agree with everything. It was going to be a long process for all of them, but at least the truth was out now. I reached Tennessee by late afternoon. The countryside felt like a different world compared to the fast-paced chaos of the city. The air was fresher, the landscape greener, and the quiet was exactly what I needed. The family farm was a couple of miles out of town, surrounded by rolling fields and a few scattered houses. I pulled into the driveway, greeted by the familiar sight of the old barn and farmhouse. Uncle Steve had done a good job making sure the place was livable. I parked the U-Haul in front of the house, stepped out, and took a deep breath. It felt like coming home. The next few days were a blur of unpacking and settling in. I spent my time fixing up the place, working in the barn, and setting up the small tractor repair business I'd planned for months. The simplicity of the work was therapeutic. After 2 decades of managing tech projects and leading teams, there was something calming about working with my hands again, getting into the dirt and grease, and focusing on tangible tasks. It wasn't long before Sarah came by. We kept in touch for a while, but now that I was back in town, things felt different. She had always been there as a friend, but lately, it had become more. I wasn't ready to jump into anything serious just yet, but her presence was comforting. We sat on the porch one evening, watching the sunset, with the soft hum of cicadas in the background. So, how does it feel to be back? She asked, sipping from her glass of iced tea. It feels right, I said, staring out at the fading horizon. It feels like I can breathe again. She smiled, her gaze softening. I'm glad you made it out of there. You deserve better. Yeah, I said, nodding slowly. I guess I do. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. There were still a lot of loose ends to tie up back in New York. Finalizing the divorce, selling the house, dealing with the fallout from Linda's affair. But here in Tennessee, none of that seemed to matter. I had a fresh start. About a week after settling in, I got a call from my lawyer. He'd filed the divorce papers, and it wouldn't be long before Linda was served. It was only a matter of time now. I'd prepared myself for this moment, but part of me still felt a twinge of sadness. Despite everything, we'd spent over 2 decades together, raised 3 sons, built a life. And now, it was all unraveling. Linda, as expected, didn't take it well. After she was served, she called me in a rage, accusing me of ruining her life, destroying our family, and embarrassing her in front of everyone. I listened quietly, letting her vent, but I had nothing more to say to her. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. The hardest part, though, was the effect it had on our sons. Jack called me a few days later, still trying to wrap his head around everything. Dad, you're not going to believe this, he said. Mom's trying to spin the whole thing, like you're the bad guy. She's saying you blindsided her. I sighed. That doesn't surprise me. She told Adam that you were planning this for years, that you never cared about the family. She's making herself the victim. I expected as much. She can tell whatever story she wants. You boys know the truth. Jack was silent for a moment. Yeah, we do. It's just hard. You know? Everything's different now. I know it is, son, but we'll get through this. You and your brothers are strong. You'll figure it out. As the weeks went by, life in Tennessee started to feel like home. I built a routine, working in the barn during the day, fixing tractors and machinery for local farmers, and spending evenings on the porch with Sarah or visiting with old friends I hadn't seen in years. One afternoon, I got a call from Adam. He'd been the quietest of my 3 sons throughout all of this, but now he wanted to talk. Dad, I've been thinking a lot about what happened, he said. I don't know how to deal with it. It's okay to feel lost, Adam. This is a lot to process. I just, I don't know if I can forgive Mom. I've been trying, but every time I think about what she did, it just makes me angry. I paused, considering my response. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, Adam. It's about letting go of the anger so you can move on. You don't have to make peace with her actions, but you do need to find peace for yourself. There was a long pause on the other end. I'll try, Dad. That's all you can do. Life in Tennessee was simple, but it was everything I needed. Linda's name rarely crossed my mind anymore. I had a new future, one that was full of promise, and for the first time in years, I felt truly free. One evening, I got a text from Jack. Dad, there's something you need to know. Mom's losing it. I hadn't spoken to Linda since the divorce papers were served, and I had kept my distance from the fallout, but this piqued my curiosity. I called him back immediately. What's going on, Jack? She's been acting really strange. She's been telling Adam and Brian that you manipulated us all into turning against her. She's even started calling Greg, trying to make it seem like you were the one who drove her into his arms. Greg? I asked, barely able to contain my disbelief. She's still in contact with him after everything that happened? Yeah, and it gets worse. Beth, Greg's wife, found out and kicked him out. He's been crashing at some friend's place. She's filing for divorce, too. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a long sigh. It was only a matter of time before everything caught up with them. I think she's trying to spin this around so that she doesn't come out looking like the bad guy, Jack continued. But it's not working. She's losing her grip. The reality of the situation hit me harder than I expected. Even though I was physically removed from everything, it was still my family being torn apart. I had hoped the divorce would be the end of it, but Linda was making sure it was far from over. Do your brothers know about this? I asked. Yeah, we've talked about it. Adam's furious. Brian is trying to keep the peace, but it's not working. She keeps calling us, trying to pull us back in. Let me talk to them, I said, feeling the need to set things straight. I'll give them a call tonight. After hanging up with Jack, I took a deep breath, trying to collect my thoughts. As much as I wanted to leave the past behind, it seemed like it wasn't ready to let go of me just yet. I dialed Adam first. Hey, Dad, Adam answered, his voice tense. Jack told me what's been going on, I said, cutting straight to the point. Are you okay? Adam let out a bitter laugh. Am I okay? No, not really. She's trying to guilt-trip me into coming back to New York. She keeps saying that I'm abandoning her, that you manipulated all of us. Adam, you know that's not true, I said firmly. Your mother made her choices. We all saw the proof. You don't owe her anything. You're an adult, and you can make your own decisions. I know that, Dad, but it's hard. She's my mom. I don't want to hate her, but every time she calls, it's like she's trying to drag me into her mess. She's even blaming you for her affair with Greg, saying that you were neglecting her. It's messed up. I paused, letting his words sink in. I can't control what she says, Adam, but I can tell you this. I've always loved you boys, and I've always done my best to be there for you. Your mother's actions were her own. You don't have to take responsibility for them. Adam sighed. I'm trying, Dad. It's just hard to figure it all out. I know it is, I said softly, but you're stronger than you think. You'll get through this. After I hung up, I called Brian, who was more level-headed but equally worn out by the drama. We talked for a while, and I reassured him that they didn't have to choose sides. I just wanted them to live their lives without being burdened by the weight of Linda's actions. By the end of the conversation, I felt a little more at ease, though I knew this wasn't the last of it. The next few weeks were relatively calm. I kept busy with work, and Sarah and I had started spending more time together. It wasn't serious yet, but we enjoyed each other's company, and I appreciated having someone who understood where I was coming from. She had her own baggage, but we were careful not to rush anything. Then, one crisp Saturday morning, something unexpected happened. I was working on an old tractor in the barn when I heard the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway. Wiping the grease off my hands, I walked out to see who it was. A black sedan was pulling up, and when the door opened, I couldn't believe my eyes. It was Linda. She stepped out of the car, her face pale and drawn. She looked nothing like the vibrant, confident woman I once knew. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and her eyes were swollen, like she hadn't slept in days. "Colin, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. I crossed my arms and leaned against the barn door. "What are you doing here, Linda?" "I came to see you," she said, her voice shaky but resolute. "I need to explain. I need you to hear me out." "There's nothing to explain," I said coldly. "You made your choices. I made mine." She stepped closer, her hands wringing together nervously. "Please, Colin. I've lost everything. The boys won't talk to me. Greg left me. I'm alone." "You're alone because of your own actions," I replied, my voice hardening. "You can't blame anyone else for that." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I wasn't moved. I had spent too long being manipulated by her emotions. This time, I wasn't going to let her pull me back into her web. "Colin, please," she begged. "I know I messed up, but I'm not that person anymore. I've changed. I'm trying to fix things." I shook my head. "It's too late, Linda. You had years to fix things. You had years to be honest with me, to respect our marriage, to be a good mother to our sons. But you chose to lie. You chose to cheat. You don't get to come back now and ask for forgiveness." She broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. "I'm sorry, Colin. I'm so sorry." I sighed, feeling a small pang of pity for her, but I couldn't let it cloud my judgment. "I don't hate you, Linda," I said, my voice softening just a little. "But I can't forgive you. Not after everything that's happened. You need to move on, just like I have." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with desperation. "Can't we at least try to be friends? For the boys?" I hesitated. "For the boys, maybe. But you need to understand something. I've built a new life here. I'm happy, and you're not part of it anymore." She nodded slowly, wiping the tears from her face. "I understand." After a long, awkward silence, she turned and walked back to her car. I watched her drive away, feeling a strange sense of finality. This was the last time I would let Linda have any power over me. Whatever relationship we had was now truly dead and buried. A week after Linda's unexpected visit, I received a call from my lawyer. The house in New York had been sold, and the divorce settlement was finalized. Linda got half, as expected, but I didn't care. I had my freedom, and that was worth more than any property. As I signed the final documents, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was officially over. That evening, Sarah and I went out to dinner to celebrate. We'd been spending more time together, and I found myself looking forward to our conversations. She had been through her own messy divorce years ago, and we often talked about how those experiences had shaped us. "How does it feel to finally be free?" she asked, clinking her glass of wine against mine. "It feels good," I admitted. "Really good." She smiled. "I'm glad. You deserve it." We spent the rest of the evening laughing and talking, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was truly living again. The past was behind me, and I was ready for whatever the future held. But life had one more surprise in store for me. A few days later, I was out running errands when my phone buzzed with a text from Brian. "Dad, you're going to want to sit down for this. Mom's in the hospital." My heart skipped a beat as I read the message. I called him immediately. "What happened?" "She had a breakdown," Brian said, his voice tight with emotion. "They admitted her to the psych ward. She's not doing well." I didn't know how to respond. After everything that had happened, I hadn't expected this. Linda, the woman who had always seemed so put together, had finally crumbled. "Is she going to be okay?" I asked, struggling to process the news. "They're not sure," Brian said quietly. "She's been under a lot of stress. The doctors think it's a combination of things: depression, anxiety." "It's bad, Dad." I felt a wave of guilt wash over me. Despite everything, she was still the mother of my children, and now she was falling apart. "Do you want me to come up there?" I asked. "I don't know," Brian replied, his voice uncertain. "I think she needs help, but I don't know if seeing you would make things worse." We talked for a while longer, and I promised to stay in touch, letting Brian and his brothers handle things on their terms. I wasn't ready to step back into Linda's life, but I also couldn't ignore what was happening. Linda's breakdown was a reminder that no matter how much distance I put between us, We were still connected in some way. I didn't know what the future held for her or for us, but I knew one thing for sure. I had made the right decision in leaving. Life in Tennessee continued on, but the news about Linda stayed with me. Even though I had moved on, the ties to the past weren't completely severed. The boys stayed in touch, keeping me updated on her condition, and slowly, they began to reconcile their feelings toward her. It wasn't easy, but they were strong, and they found their own ways to cope. As for me, Sarah and I grew closer with each passing day. We didn't rush anything, but we both knew that something real was blossoming between us. We spent our evenings together, talking about the future, making plans for the life we both wanted to build. Sure, here's a rewritten version where Linda lives in a small apartment instead of the family home. Linda had moved into a small apartment after the house was sold in the divorce. It wasn't much, just a modest one-bedroom place in a quieter part of the city. When I arrived at the building, I could already tell things had taken a turn for the worse. The exterior was run down, with peeling paint and cracks in the sidewalk leading up to the entrance. It was a far cry from the comfortable suburban home we had shared for over 2 decades. Jack and I walked up the narrow staircase to the second floor, the dim hallway lit by flickering overhead lights. When we reached Linda's apartment, the door was slightly ajar, and the smell hit me as soon as we stepped inside. Stale alcohol, cigarette smoke, and a musty odor that spoke of neglect. The apartment itself was tiny, cluttered with empty wine bottles and fast food containers strewn across the small kitchen counter. The living room was barely furnished, just an old couch and a coffee table covered in magazines and ashtrays. The space felt cramped and claustrophobic, a stark contrast to the spacious home we once shared. Linda was sitting on the worn-out couch, a glass of wine in her hand. She didn't even look up when we walked in, her focus seemingly locked on the faded wallpaper. Her appearance shocked me. She had lost weight, her clothes hung loosely on her, and her hair, once perfectly styled, was now tied back in a messy bun. "Mom," Jack said softly, stepping forward. "Dad's here." Linda's eyes flicked toward me for a moment, but there was no recognition in her gaze, just a hollow emptiness. This wasn't the vibrant, confident woman I had married. This was someone lost, trapped in a spiral of self-destruction. "Colin," she muttered, her voice hoarse. "What are you doing here?" "I came because Jack called me." "You're not well, Linda," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the wave of sadness that hit me. "You need help," she scoffed, taking another sip of wine. "Help? From you? I don't need anything from you." I looked around the small, dingy apartment, feeling the weight of how far she had fallen. The woman who had once taken pride in her surroundings now lived in a space that mirrored the chaos inside her mind.